Stop. Before you keep watching this, stand up right now. Find a tape measure, use the span of your hand, count steps, whatever, but measure it. I'm not speaking to you rhetorically. I'm speaking to you seriously. Measure it. Do you have it? Good. Keep that number in your head, because in the next few minutes, that number will stop being a measurement and will become a question that no one has ever asked you about the space you live in. And when I ask it, you won't be able to ignore it. I want you to think about something. Your house has measurements. Your hallway has a width. Your ceiling has a height. Your doors have a standard width, and you've spent years in that space, assuming those measurements exist because someone, at some point, calculated how much space a person needs to live comfortably, right? That's what you've been led to believe. But right now, I want you to answer one thing, just one, and I need you to really think about it before you answer. Do you know who decided those measurements? Not the architect of your building, not the developer who sold the apartment, not the engineer who signed the plans. Someone long before them, with a criterion that had absolutely nothing to do with your comfort, with your well-being, with your life inside that space. That criterion exists. It has a name. It has a date. It has a very specific origin. And what I'm going to tell you today is that the origin is not where you think it is. Do you remember the number in your head? The width of your hallway. Keep it there. Let me ask you more questions, because this doesn't end here. Why are the doors in your home the width they are? Why aren't they 10 centimeters wider? Who decided that was enough? Why is your hallway just wide enough for someone to walk through facing forward, but if another person comes from the opposite direction, one of you has to turn sideways or press against the wall? Why have you assumed that's normal? Because you have assumed it. All of us have. We've spent decades living in spaces with measurements we've never questioned, and no one has told us that those measurements come from somewhere, that they have a history, that the story didn't begin in the design of homes. It began in a different kind of building. Buildings where people didn't enter by choice. What kind of buildings do you think that was? Think about it, because the answer will change the way you look at every corner of your house. Right now, there are millions of people in Spain, in Mexico, in Argentina, in Colombia, in every Spanish-speaking country, sleeping every night in apartments with hallways that inherited a measurement from more than 150 years ago. 150 years. And that measurement didn't come from old houses. It didn't come from villas or palaces or the popular housing of the 19th century. It came from institutions. From the buildings the 19th century constructed to contain the people society didn't know where to put. The sick, the insane, prisoners, the dying. Those buildings had very specific corridors designed with a very concrete criterion that had nothing to do with the comfort of the person walking through them. And that criterion ended up in the construction regulations of the 20th century, which is the century in which the vast majority of the housing we live in today was built. I'm not telling you your house is a prison. I'm telling you something more uncomfortable than that. I'm telling you the measurements of your home were calculated with the same logic used to calculate the measurements of a prison. And no one has ever told you that because no one has ever asked you. Do you remember your number? The hallway width. Now I'm going to tell you something about that number that you won't be able to ignore. That number, that exact width of your hallway, is the same width that Victorian hospitals established for their internal corridors. Why? So that a coffin could pass through without scraping the walls. Wait, before that information fully settles in, I need you to understand something. What I just told you is not a metaphor. It's not an exaggeration to make the video more dramatic. It's a documented historical fact with a technical explanation, a very precise timeline, and consequences for modern design that I'm going to show you in the next few minutes. But you need to stay, because the story of how that measurement left hospitals, passed through asylums, crossed 19th century prisons, and ended up in residential construction regulations of the 20th century cannot be told in 2 minutes. It can be simplified, it can be summarized, but if I simplify it, you miss the part that changes how you understand it. And the part that changes how you understand it is the part you need. In a few minutes, I'm going to show you a connection between the design of Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, built in 1878, and the technical housing regulations that were applied throughout the 20th century across the world. A connection that is documented, that has names, that has dates, and that no real estate brochure, no building tour, no purchase contract has ever explained to you. Stay. If you leave before the end, you'll walk away with the question, but not the answer. Before we begin the story, I want you to do one last thing. Tonight, when you walk down your hallway, notice something you've probably never consciously looked at. Notice how much space you have to turn around, to stretch your arms out to the sides, to pass another person without one of you stepping aside. Look at that. Then ask yourself whether that looks like the design of a home, or the design of a corridor where someone, 150 years ago, needed something else to fit through. That's what we're about to see. To understand why your hallway measures what it measures, you need to understand what was happening in the world in the mid-19th century. Europe and America were in the middle of a brutal transformation. Cities were growing at a speed no one had ever seen before. Factories filled neighborhoods with workers. Hospitals were overflowing. Prisons were overflowing too, and governments faced a problem they didn't know how to solve. What to do with the people who didn't fit into the new industrial order, the mentally ill, criminals, the poor without families, those who simply couldn't function within the pace the new society demanded. The response was construction, massive construction. Institutions built on a huge scale that could contain hundreds, sometimes thousands of people under one roof. And to build those institutions, someone had to decide how to organize them, how wide their corridors should be, how wide their doors should be, how much space each person needed to exist inside those walls without the building collapsing logistically. Those decisions were made by architects working for governments and institutions. And those architects started from a very simple principle. How wide is the largest object that needs to move through this corridor? In a hospital, the largest object moving through a corridor is a stretcher or a coffin. That's where everything begins. In 1848, a physician and reformer named Thomas Story Kirkbride published what would become the most influential technical document in 19th century psychiatric architecture. It was called On the Construction, Organization, and General Arrangements of Hospitals for the Insane, a title that sounds like another era today, but for decades it was the Bible for architects designing asylums in the United States and across much of Europe. Kirkbride wasn't a bad man. He genuinely believed the physical environment could heal mental illness. He believed that if you built a structure with enough light, gardens, order, and symmetry, the sick mind could recover simply by inhabiting that space. What he could not foresee was that his architectural model, designed to heal, would later become the blueprint for some of the most oppressive institutions of the 20th century, and that his measurements would outlive him for more than a century. The Kirkbride model had a very specific feature in its corridors. Main corridors were designed with a minimum width of 8 to 10 feet, roughly 240 to 300 centimeters. But the secondary corridors, the ones connecting individual rooms with common areas, were much narrower. How narrow? Wide enough for a stretcher to pass, for staff to escort a patient, for a coffin to be carried out if necessary. Those widths ranged between roughly 85 and 100 centimeters. Does that number sound familiar? The Danvers State Hospital was built in Massachusetts in 1878, following what was known as the Kirkbride model. From the air, the building doesn't look like a hospital. It looks like something designed to contain people, to monitor them, to make sure that what was inside never reached the outside. Its floor plan resembles what architects call a batwing plan, a central body with long, symmetrical wings stretching outward, a structure designed to maximize surveillance from a single central point, while limiting the ability of patients to see beyond their own corridor. This wasn't accidental. Corridors were designed so that someone walking through them could not see the next corridor, could not orient themselves inside the building, could not understand how many people were there or where they were. 19th century architects understood something that modern neuroscience has only recently confirmed. Spatial disorientation is a form of control. When you cannot mentally map the space around you, your brain enters a constant state of alertness, a state that slowly drains energy and weakens resistance. This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's environmental psychology, backed by research from the last 2 decades. Now let's talk about Spandau Prison. Spandau is known for housing Nazi war criminals after the Nuremberg trials. One of them, Rudolf Hess. He spent 41 years there, alone, in a prison that had been built for 600 people. But what matters here is not the politics, it's the architecture. Spandau was built in 1876, 2 years before the Danvers State Hospital, and its cell corridors followed the exact same principle. Corridors just wide enough for 2 guards to walk side by side, or for a guard to walk beside a prisoner, or for a stretcher to pass through. The logic was identical. How wide is the largest thing that must move through this corridor? Everything else was built around that single measurement. The cells were calculated around the corridor, and the corridor was calculated around logistics. And logistics did not consider the well-being of the people inside. It considered only one thing: operational efficiency. So how did that logic move from prisons and asylums into residential homes? The answer is surprisingly simple. When governments began regulating residential construction in the early 20th century, they needed standards, minimum measurements, definitions of what counted as habitable space, and the engineers writing those standards did not start from scratch. They used what already existed. Hospitals, schools, prisons, institutional buildings that had already been built for decades with documented technical standards. Housing didn't yet have that tradition of codified measurements, so the existing institutional standards became the starting point, not because someone wanted homes to resemble prisons, but because technical inertia is powerful. Once a measurement enters building codes, it becomes extremely difficult to remove. Architects learn it, builders follow it, inspectors enforce it, and that's how the 85 centimeters of Victorian hospital corridors became the minimum hallway width in many residential construction standards throughout the 20th century.
Now think about your hallway again.
Because there's another layer to this. Modern research in architectural neuroscience shows that narrow transitional spaces activate subtle stress responses in the brain. They signal movement, not rest. Your brain reads them as places where your ability to react to danger is limited. Your lateral movement is restricted. Your field of vision is reduced. Even if you don't consciously feel stressed, your brain still registers the signal, and you cross that hallway multiple times every single day. Over time, those signals accumulate. Studies measuring cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, show that environments with narrow circulation spaces, low ceilings, limited natural light, and restricted visual fields are associated with higher baseline stress levels. There is also the matter of sound. Narrow corridors create a very specific acoustic effect. Sound reflects between parallel walls in a way that subtly amplifies footsteps, voices, and doors closing. Your brain actually uses sound to interpret space. In a narrow hallway, the sound confirms what your eyes already see. The walls are close. The space is tight. This is a passage, not a place to remain. Again, your brain registers that, not consciously, but constantly. So what can you do with this information? If you can renovate, there are design strategies that can change how your brain perceives the space without moving the walls. Light, color, the perceived height of the ceiling, continuous visual lines, and the removal of obstacles that interrupt the path. All of these can transform the psychological experience of a narrow hallway. But if you cannot renovate, at least now you understand something you probably never questioned before. You know where that measurement came from. You know it wasn't originally designed for comfort. It was designed for logistics in institutions built more than a century ago. But before you go, there is one more thing. Hallways are only the beginning. There is another element in your home with a very similar institutional origin. Your windows, not their size, not their view, their proportions, the relationship between the frame and the wall, the angle at which light enters. Research from the early 20th century connected residential window standards to studies examining how people perceive the outside world from inside enclosed spaces. Not to make the interior more comfortable, but to make the exterior feel less attractive. And once you understand that distinction, you will never look at your windows the same way again. That story comes next.